What will happen if the influx of African natural resources stops in the West? Well, in that case, all the Western countries, including the whole of Europe, the Americas and Canada, will collapse. If you don't believe that, you have to know how these Western countries use African natural resources, taking them for granted. Back in 2008, French President Jacques Chirac said that without Africa, France would slide down into the rank of third world power. In other words, he candidly confessed that without African resources, a dark age would linger in France. This is also true for the rest of Europe. Perhaps at that time, he did not know that African countries would be united and start thinking about supplying resources to the West. But now, standing right in the United Nations General Assembly in New York, the center of the West, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa declared that from now on, the West should not count African wealth as its own. For the people at the high table in the West, controlling the reins of power, this was the end of the story. But what does that really mean, and how Africa can literally deprive the West of the progress it brags so much about? Let's find that out in this video. At the UN General Assembly, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, said things which the West is not habituated to listen to. He said that despite centuries having passed since the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, and decades since the conclusion of colonial resource exploitation in Africa, the continent's people find themselves once again bearing the burdens of industrialization in the Northern Hemisphere and the development of prosperous nations worldwide. He continued and said that African communities are no longer willing to shoulder this price. He declared that several countries in the Northern Hemisphere evaluate their assets based on the mineral wealth found beneath African soil. This won't continue because the time when the Southern Hemisphere of the world used to develop and enrich the Northern Hemisphere of the world is over. President Ramaphosa stressed that Africa's riches inherently belong to its people, and the mineral resources concealed within the continent's soil must ultimately serve the interests of Africans. As per the recent speech by the South African president at the United Nations General Assembly, the unequivocal assertion is that African resources rightfully belong to Africans. The president emphasized that this claim is exclusively held by Africans who are born and raised on the continent, granting them the legitimate right to recognize African resources as a part of their wealth. However, the background to this assertion is one of audacity, given the historical context of Western countries colonizing Africa and exploiting its resources for extensive periods. This complex history has left a lasting impact, with some Western nations persisting in viewing African resources as an extension of their domain, even long after African nations achieved independence. The South African president has consistently raised this issue on various platforms, including discussions during the French Financial Summit and within BRICS. His unflagging message is that African resources are the exclusive, predominant, and absolute property of Africans. He argues that, despite the end of colonial exploitation, Africa continues to bear the costs associated with the industrialization and development of wealthier nations. In many northern countries, mineral resources beneath African soil are often regarded as valuable assets. The South African president argued with confidence that Africa's wealth unequivocally belongs to Africans, and the mineral riches beneath the African terrain must ultimately serve the benefit of Africans. This is something extraordinary, something which the African leaders were hesitant to say earlier. It shows how bold and brave African leaders have become, who are no longer willing to shoulder the burdens of the historical exploitation of their continent's resources. They are asserting the rights of African people to these resources and advocating for the rectification of past imbalances. The speech reflects a growing sense of power among African leaders and a collective call for equitable resource management and fair wealth distribution. It represents a significant withdrawal from the past when speaking out against such historical injustices was fraught with fears of repercussions from powerful Western nations. African leaders are now boldly advancing their claims to resources that have long been perceived as belonging to the global community, while simultaneously being disproportionately exploited and underrepresented by Africans themselves. This evolving discourse marks a profound shift in Africa's engagement with the world, as it seeks a more balanced and just global order. You should know that we are seeing an era of change in Africa. That's why Africans are becoming increasingly aware of the prolonged marginalization they have endured, living in the shadow of Western dominance. They are now contemplating the potential consequences of standing up for their rights, which may include facing unfair business deals, sanctions, and travel advisories. The pivotal point lies in the courage to speak the truth and firmly hold their ground, a stance that African leaders are adopting. Here, you should know that Africa is a treasure trove of resources, with its significant gold reserves. The continent boasts 40% of the world's gold, and substantial amounts of chromium, platinum, and other precious metals, some as high as 90%. Gold can be unearthed in countries like Ghana, South Africa, Mali, Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria, with the potential for even more discoveries, including gold deposits in Kenya. Diamonds are abundant across Africa, in the largest reserves found only in Africa. These precious gems can be found in Angola, South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, the DRC, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, and numerous other locations. No matter which country you put your finger on the African map, it is brimming with natural resources. It raises the relevant question of why the wealth from these resources doesn't predominantly remain in the countries of origin, but rather finds its way to destinations like Dubai, the UK, or the US. Africa's oil reserves, a strategic resource, are distributed among countries such as Libya, Algeria, Nigeria, Angola, South Sudan, and Egypt. Yet the wealth generated from these reserves doesn't seem to stay within the borders of the producing nations. The root of the issue often lies in the unfavorable terms and conditions negotiated by multinational corporations. A case study is President Barack Obama's efforts to broker an oil drilling deal with President Kenyatta of Kenya. The proposed terms, spanning an 80-year drilling commitment before Kenyans could assume control, raised questions about what would be left after 8 decades and why the generated wealth doesn't remain within the country. These challenges persist because there are insufficient laws compelling these corporations to reinvest their profits locally. Consequently, profits are funneled overseas, depriving resource-rich nations of their rightful benefits. Consider the case of Ivory Coast and Ghana, major cocoa bean producers responsible for about 65% of the world's cocoa bean supply. However, the true profits from the chocolate industry are concentrated in Switzerland and various parts of Europe. These regions benefit from the cocoa industry without fully understanding the labor and dedication required for its cultivation. This arises from the reluctance to add value to their products and unfavorable trade agreements. This sense of entitlement, where foreign entities dictate how nations manage their resources, is rooted in the colonial history of Africa. The present challenge is to transform this dynamic, assert control over resources, and reshape the power balance in resource management and wealth distribution. In an evolving era, African leaders are fearlessly asserting their rights and advocating for equitable resource management, marking a shift from a past where the world overlooked Africa toward a more just and balanced global order. Africans are now vocalizing their concerns and advocating for themselves, with the South African president setting a prime example. The South African president's message is crystal clear. Africa's wealth inherently belongs to Africans. Ultimately, the mineral riches concealed beneath African soil must benefit the African populace. The South African president's insights reveal a profound comprehension of the situation, rooted in a first-hand perspective of the contracts multinational corporations maintain with African nations. It presents a compelling argument against Western claims to African resources, resonating with the experiences of many Africans who question why their resource-rich continent remains impoverished. But whatever the South African president said is not new. He has been saying this at various events. However, saying this candidly in the United Nations General Assembly was a much-needed thing to do, to allow the West to know that it should start preparing for its collapse. Earlier, at the Russia-Africa Summit, he also said this. Among the relatively small group of African leaders who exhibited the determination to participate in this event, the president took center stage. During the summit, he did not hold back, directly confronting the West for their treatment of Africa as an extension of their own territories. This perspective implies that African resources are essentially seen as an annex to Western assets, permitting them to dictate the terms and conditions of doing business within African nations. President Ramaphosa stressed that since achieving independence, African nations have assumed full sovereignty, no longer considering themselves subservient to external powers. However, true freedom entails the autonomy of African countries to independently determine their partners and the conditions of their engagements. Furthermore, he stressed the need to abandon the historical practice of measuring wealth based on the mineral resources hidden beneath African soil, likening it to the abhorrent practice of quantifying the number of slaves in the past. The relationship between Africa and other nations, particularly Western powers, must be founded on principles of respect and mutual benefit. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The reason why the South African president said this at the Russian-Africa summit was to let Russia know that African countries are not in the mood to just change masters. In other words, African countries are not leaving the West because they want a new master to exploit them, replacing the West. Rather, it's because now African countries want to engage with only those countries which offer the same respect and benefits they want to have. You should know that Russia has emerged as a prominent player, aiming to forge closer ties with the continent. Russia's approach is characterized by a distinct strategy, one that employs a form of reverse psychology. In contrast to the way the West is often perceived, Russia positions itself as an equal partner and collaborator. This approach hinges on the promise to respect African nations and provide support. President Vladimir Putin, in particular, has been actively engaged in extending assistance to African countries and participating in projects designed to advance Africa's development while enhancing his standing on the continent. The specific interests of Russia in Africa are evolving, and as the country deepens its involvement with the continent, its intentions will likely become clearer. Last year's Russian-African summit was a significant milestone, featuring the participation of 43 heads of state. President Ramaphosa advocated for a transformation that would ensure Africa, as a unified bloc, has a voice, comparable to forming a G21. He also stressed the issue of Africa's underrepresentation on the United Nations Security Council, underlining the necessity of African involvement in decision-making processes that have a direct impact on the continent. President Ramaphosa said that Africa must hold a seat at tables where consequential decisions are made, firmly arguing that the continent has often left its fate in the hands of those with limited genuine interest in Africa and its needs. His stance reflects the belief that Africa's exclusion from these decision-making forums is both unfair and unacceptable, particularly considering the continent's significant population and the interconnected nature of the world. He said that South Africa maintains a responsible position on the importance of negotiation, dialogue, and adherence to the United Nations Charter as fundamental principles for achieving peaceful and equitable conflict resolutions. The nation is fervently hopeful that through constructive engagement and negotiations, ongoing conflicts like the one involving the Russian Federation and Ukraine can be effectively resolved. President Ramaphosa wasted no time in addressing a prominent issue in the way Western countries engage with Africa. While these nations often publicly profess their commitment to providing aid and support to the continent, the nature of their assistance is frequently isolating, and in some cases perpetuates cycles of poverty. It's because these Western countries loot African resources, and to show how generous they offer minimal aid. In turn, these aids keep African countries dependent on the West. However, they never think that the aid which is being offered is only a fraction of what the West took from Africa. President Ramaphosa's explicit analysis showed the Western perspective on Africa, a viewpoint likely to generate controversy. Nevertheless, he courageously exposed a harsh reality. Africa's natural resources have frequently been treated as extensions of Western territories, granting Western leaders the power to exert influence and even intervene in African affairs. For instance, Emmanuel Macron's reference to French interests in Niger ignited strong reactions. President Ramaphosa stressed that Africa's natural resources rightfully belong to the people of African nations. These nations possess the sovereign authority to choose their business partners and how their resources are utilized. Multinational corporations operating in Africa often extract resources, repatriate profits to their home countries, harm the environment, and offer meager compensation to host nations. This pattern necessitates transformation. President Ramaphosa asserts that there must be respect for the sovereignty of African nations and their jurisdiction over their natural resources. Europe's wealth should not be calculated based on the minerals beneath African soil, an approach similar to historical times when wealth was determined by the number of slaves taken from the continent. The new approach should be based on mutual respect and mutual benefit when Africa engages with other nations globally. That's when it becomes clear that Africa is not poor. Europe has stolen African resources and kept them poor. It's part of a broader wicked strategy to keep exploiting Africa while creating an illusion that Africa is inherently poor itself. Well, that's wrong, and the world is knowing this. According to a report, Sub-Saharan Africa is in fact a net creditor to the rest of the world, with more than $41 billion on the plus side. Although there is an inflow of money, approximately $161 billion per year, in the form of loans, remittances, and aid, there's also a substantial outflow of $203 billion from the continent. A chunk of this outflow, roughly $68 billion, is attributed to evaded taxes. Sizable multinational corporations, operating within Africa, often exploit legal loopholes, presenting their profits as if they were generated in tax havens. These so-called illicit financial flows constitute approximately 6.1% of Africa's entire gross domestic product, 3 times the amount received in aid. Furthermore, these corporations send an additional $30 billion back to their home countries or other destinations as repatriated profits, despite having been earned in Africa. The City of London is awash with profits extracted from Africa's resources and labor. Additionally, Africa's wealth is indirectly drained through various means. The report estimates that $29 billion is lost each year due to illegal activities like logging, fishing, and wildlife trade. Another $36 billion is owed to Africa due to the anticipated damage from climate change, which hampers their development as they are restricted from using fossil fuels, much like Europe once did. It's crucial to note that Africa is not responsible for the global climate crisis, yet it will bear a disproportionate share of its consequences, and the required funds have yet to materialize. Furthermore, it's a generous assumption that all the wealth flowing into Africa genuinely benefits its people. Loans to governments and the private sector, totaling over $50 billion, often lead to insurmountable and morally reprehensible debts. Ghana, for instance, loses 30% of its government revenue to debt repayments, as these loans were often speculative, based on high commodity prices, and carried excessive interest rates. An egregious example is an aluminum smelter in Mozambique, financed by loans and aid, which is currently costing the country £21 for every £1 received by the Mozambique government. Even British aid, utilized to establish private educational institutions and healthcare centers, can undermine the development of robust public services. This has resulted in the closure of private schools in Uganda and Kenya. While a few Africans have benefited from this economic system, there are approximately 165,000 very wealthy Africans, with combined assets of $860 billion. However, where do they predominantly stash their wealth? Well, the answer is tax havens. In 2014, an estimate came to light, revealing that wealthy Africans were secretly storing an astonishing $500 billion in offshore tax havens. This quiet wealth drainage negatively impacts Africa's population, as it stems from an economic system that enables a select group of wealthy Africans to amass riches while allowing a continuous outflow of wealth from the continent. The point is that even the wealth generated by rich Africans seeps out of Africa, benefiting the West's financial system. Despite having precious resources, Africa stays poor because these resources are taken straight to Western countries, offering only pennies to African countries. You must know the resources Africa holds and still stays poor. Once you know this, you will be frustrated with how much plundering is possible. Hidden beneath the African continent's surface lies an abundance of invaluable mineral resources. In the year 2019, Africa extracted close to 1 billion tons of minerals, totaling an impressive value of $406 billion. The United Nations reveals that Africa is the custodian of roughly 30% of the globe's mineral reserves, 12% of the world's oil reserves, and 8% of its natural gas reserves. Moreover, the continent holds a substantial share, approximately 40% of the world's gold reserves, and boasts an impressive portion, up to 90%, of vital resources such as chromium and platinum. In the contemporary world, our electronic devices rely on a diverse range of minerals, spanning from aluminum to zinc. The year 2021 witnessed the sale of a staggering 1.5 billion smartphones worldwide, a significant upsurge from the 122 million units sold in 2007. Interestingly, over half of a typical mobile phone's components, including its electronics, display, battery, and speakers, are constructed from minerals procured through mining and initial processing. Crucial metals for battery production, namely lithium and cobalt, largely derive from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, contributing to roughly 63% of the global cobalt production. Across Africa's 54 diverse countries, petroleum and coal reign as the most abundant minerals in 22 of these nations. In 2019, Nigeria was the largest petroleum producer on the continent, accounting for a substantial 25% of the total production, followed by Angola at 17% and Algeria at 16%. Simultaneously, metals such as gold, iron, titanium, zinc, and copper constitute the primary minerals in 11 African countries. Ghana emerges as the continent's foremost gold producer, closely followed by South Africa and Mali. For 13 of Africa's countries, industrial minerals such as diamonds, gypsum, salt, sulfur, and phosphates serve as their primary commodities. Notably, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is Africa's top producer of industrial diamonds, with Botswana and South Africa following suit. Botswana takes the lead within Africa for the production of gem-quality diamonds that are commonly used in jewelry. Now, unless African countries reclaim their resources, nothing is possible. The South African president has now shown that soon this will start, and the West must get ready. What do you think? Will the West try to blackmail African countries so they export precious natural resources to the West? Or will this time be different, and African countries will really take the control back into their hands? Let us know your thoughts on what African countries should do to avoid getting blackmailed. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.